In the world of elite thoroughbred racing, where a single yearling can sell for $3 million and buyers inspect bloodlines the way bankers inspect credit histories, a damaged colt with a compromised left foreleg sold for $1,800, and the men who passed on him called it a generous offer. This was not a rescue. This was not a charity. This was a transaction so small, so beneath the radar of an industry built on pedigree and spectacle, that the sale barn didn't even bother to list his name in the prominent columns. He was inventory. He was a tax write-off with a heartbeat. The bloodstock agents who walked past his stall that morning had seen 1,000 horses like him, angular, off-balanced, built wrong from the cannon bone down, and they had learned, through decades of expensive mistakes, that the horses who looked like problems almost always became problems. They were not wrong about most horses, they were catastrophically wrong about this one, because that $1,800 colt, the one with the irregular gait, the one the veterinarians flagged in 3 separate pre-purchase examinations, the one whose left foreleg carried a stress history that should have ended a racing career before it began, that colt would go on to win the Kentucky Derby, the Preakness Stakes, and the Belmont Stakes. He would complete the Triple Crown. He would do it carrying weight that elite horses half his age refused to haul. And he would do it in times that haunted the sport for a generation. The data still doesn't make sense. The data never really has. The veterinarian's report read like an indictment. Irregular bone remodeling in the left fore, asymmetrical shoulder musculature, a hind-end angulation that biomechanical specialists described, with clinical detachment, as structurally suboptimal for sustained high-speed performance. His stride was too short for his frame. His weight distribution loaded the compromised leg in a pattern that should have produced a breakdown within the first 6 furlongs of serious racing. He was not, by any measurable standard, built for what he was about to do. Yet here is what those reports could not measure: the density of his determination, the architecture of his will. That is not mysticism. That is not sentimentality. That is the honest admission of a sport that has spent 2 centuries trying to reduce greatness to mathematics and has never quite managed it. You can weigh a horse, you can measure his heart girth, his cannon bone circumference, his oxygen efficiency at maximum exertion. You can run his bloodlines back 17 generations and calculate the statistical probability of elite performance down to 2 decimal places. And then a horse like this one walks onto a track, limping slightly, unglamorous, unbothered, and dismantles every projection. It happened on a Tuesday morning when the track was still wet and almost nobody was watching. The trainer who had purchased him, not out of genius but out of budget, had set modest expectations. Get the colt sound enough to enter a maiden race, collect a modest purse, move on. That was the plan. Plans, in this sport, have a habit of colliding with reality at high velocity. The colt broke from the gate that morning with the kind of acceleration that stops a stopwatch operator mid-breath. Not because it was flashy, not because it looked like the slow-motion heroics you see in retrospective documentaries. It was the efficiency of it, the absolute mechanical economy of effort. While the other horses in the workout burned through their reserves in the first quarter mile, this colt seemed to negotiate with the track rather than fight it. His compromised leg, the one that should have been a liability, found its angle, found its rhythm, and then found a gear that nobody had put there. The trainer did not say anything for a long moment. He looked at his stopwatch, he looked at it again, then he looked back at the colt being walked toward the barn, and something shifted behind his eyes. Not excitement, something older and quieter than excitement. Recognition. The first race was not a performance, it was a question. A compressed, furious interrogation directed at every expert who had assessed this animal and found him wanting. He did not win elegantly. He won the way a freight train wins a race against a sports car on a dirt road, through relentless, grinding forward momentum that absorbed punishment and refused to acknowledge it. The margin of victory was not dramatic. The time was not record-breaking, but something about the way he finished, still accelerating in the final 16th, when every other horse was decelerating, still reaching, still demanding more from a body that had been written off before the season began, told anyone willing to watch carefully that this was not a fluke, it was a declaration. Race after race, the pattern held. Rivals with pristine veterinary reports and 7-figure price tags fell behind him in the stretch. Trainers wept. Had spent years engineering the perfect specimen, watched their careful calculations evaporate in the final turn as an $1,800 horse with a compromised foreleg simply refused to lose. The industry noticed. The industry was not, at this point, impressed, it was confused. Confusion, in a sport that worships certainty, is an uncomfortable thing. Then came the Kentucky Derby. Churchill Downs in May does not forgive doubt. The track is wide and unforgiving, the field is enormous, and the history of the place presses down on every competitor like a physical weight. 19 horses broke from the gate that afternoon. 17 of them had sold for more than this colt's entire career earnings to that point. The crowd noise was a physical force, a wall of sound that the horses ran into at full speed as they cleared the first turn. He broke cleanly. He settled toward the middle of the pack, not by strategy, exactly, but by the organic geometry of 20,000 pounds of horse finding their place in the chaos. By the half-mile pole, he had moved 3 positions without appearing to try. By the far turn, the watching experts in the press box were still discussing the horses ahead of him. Then the far turn gave way to the stretch. Then the stretch opened up like a corridor of pure possibility. He did not pass horses, he absorbed them. One stride, then another, each one landing with that precise, metronomic efficiency that had shocked a trainer on a wet Tuesday morning months earlier. The crowd's noise changed register as he came to the lead. It dropped for exactly 1 second, the instinctive human pause that greets the genuinely unexpected, and then it became something enormous and primal and involuntary. He won by 2.5 lengths. The Colt with the compromised foreleg. The $1,800 inventory item. He won the Kentucky Derby. The Preakness came 2 weeks later, and this is where the story stops being about racing and starts being about something harder to name. He was not favored, the industry recalibrates slowly, and certain minds had already begun constructing explanations for the Derby result that did not require them to reconsider their original assessments. Aberration, fortunate pace, favorable track bias. The machinery of justification ran hot in the days between Baltimore and Louisville. The Preakness dismantled every gear of it. He led from the far turn and never looked back. The margin widened in the stretch as if the other horses had agreed, in some private conference, to stop trying. His fractional times were not record-setting. What they were was relentless, a metronome of forward motion that never varied, never faltered, never gave rivals the half-second of breathing room they needed to mount a challenge. The stopwatch read one thing, the eye read something else entirely, something about a creature operating outside its designated parameters. Then the Belmont, 1.5 miles, the longest of the 3, the race designed by history to find the limits of horses who have already given everything, the race that has swallowed Triple C, round dreams for decades. The gates opened, he ran, he won. And the sport went silent for just a moment, the kind of silence that falls when something has happened that the brain cannot immediately categorize. When researchers finally studied what had powered this animal through 3 of the most demanding races in American sport, the answer arrived through a combination of post-career imaging and biomechanical analysis. His left foreleg, the one flagged in 3 pre-purchase exams, the one that had defined his discount price, the one that every expert had marked as his terminal flaw, had undergone a process that veterinary science describes as adaptive cortical remodeling. The bone had not simply tolerated stress over the course of his early training, it had responded to it, rebuilt around it, grown denser and more mechanically sophisticated in the precise locations where the load was greatest. His compromised leg had become, through the accumulation of managed effort, one of the strongest structures in his body. The flaw had not been eliminated, it had been incorporated, absorbed into a biological architecture that now carried it not as a weakness but as a weapon. The average thoroughbred's cannon bone, under imaging, displays a relatively uniform density profile. His was layered, stratified, like geological record, showing the history of challenge and response compressed into a few inches of living bone. Veterinarians who examined the imaging described it, in the dry language of their discipline, as an unusual adaptive response. What they meant, translated from clinical distance into plain language, was this. The horse had rebuilt himself from the inside while the outside world was busy explaining why he couldn't run. The expert foil, in retrospect, is not the bloodstock agent who passed on him. It is not the veterinarian who filed the report. It is the concept itself, the idea that a number, a price, a preliminary assessment, a column of risk factors could contain what this animal was. The experts were not foolish. They were operating within the boundaries of what their instruments could measure. Their instruments were simply insufficient for the task. Decades have passed since that Colt walked off a sale ground at $1,800. The men who passed on him have had long careers filled with better purchased, better pedigreed, better conformed horses, horses who ran well and were forgotten at the appropriate time, as most horses are. The records this animal set have been approached but not erased. The images of his Triple Crown performances exist in archive footage, slightly washed out and grainy with age, the crowd noise distorted by the limits of old recording technology, and yet something in those images remains completely legible across time. You can see, even through the grain and the distance, the thing that no instrument captured, the absolute, unhurried certainty of a creature that never once entertained the possibility of the result it was told to accept. He was not built right. He was not priced right. He was not supposed to be here, in the record books, in the archives, in the conversations that serious people still have when they try to explain what makes a great horse great. The genomic databases now contain his profile. The biomechanical studies have been cited in veterinary literature across multiple continents. The cortical density data from that left foreleg has been replicated, analyzed, and incorporated into new frameworks for understanding how thoroughbreds adapt to training load. And yet, and here is where the science runs out of road, none of it explains the Tuesday morning workout. None of it explains why a trainer looked at a stopwatch twice in silence and felt something shift. None of it explains what the crowd heard in its own noise when he came to the lead in the stretch at Churchill Downs and the sound dropped for exactly 1 second before it became something else entirely. The data is real, the times are verified, the bone density has been measured to the micrometer. But greatness, in its truest and most unruly form, exists in the gap between what the instruments can reach and what they cannot, in the space where an $1,800 Colt, built wrong, flagged wrong, priced wrong, simply decided that the world's assessment of him was not a fact he was obligated to honor.